All right. So, we have talked about due process before. You've heard the term before. We saw it in the Gideon movie, right, where he said, I didn't get due process. So what I want to do this week, and starting off with this lecture, is dive a little bit more deeply into what due process is. Okay? So to start off, let's get a working definition of due process. Due process is the principle or the idea that nobody can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without fair legal procedures and safeguards. I'll say that again. Due process refers to the principle or the idea that nobody can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without fair legal procedures and safeguards. It places restrictions on the government in order to protect individual rights.
What comes after fair legal?
Fair legal procedures and safeguards.
What did you just say?
I said due process puts restrictions on the government in order to protect individual rights. So where does this idea come from? Well, if you think back to earlier in the school year, and we looked at where we got a lot of our ideas from, we borrowed it from Britain. Okay? And more specifically, it comes from the Magna Carta. We borrowed it from the Magna Carta, which laid out the idea that Englishmen, right, because this was England, Englishmen could not have their rights taken away except through the lawful judgment of their peers. So if you were an Englishman, your rights were protected. It could only be taken away through the lawful judgment of your peers. In case you're interested in the actual wording, it says, no free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed, or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals, or by the law of the land. So we borrow that idea. We say we like that idea, that the government cannot just arbitrarily take away your life, liberty, or property. There has to be legal procedures in place. And so we liked it so much that we borrowed it and we put it into the United States Constitution. In fact, we like it so much we put it in the Constitution twice. It shows up in the United States Constitution in the Fifth Amendment, and it shows up in the 14th Amendment? Well, why on earth is it in there twice, you wonder? An excellent question. It's in there twice because the 14th Amendment applies it specifically to the states. So the Fifth Amendment applies it to the national government, and then we came back after the Civil War and reapplied it and said this applies to the states as well. Okay, so now we have an idea of what it is, where it comes from. Let's talk about what are some of your actual due process rights. And I'm not going to give you a fully comprehensive list of every single one. What I'm going to do is kind of hit some of the main ones, starting with the very beginning of the criminal justice procedure and moving through. So your due process rights are there to protect you all the way through the legal system, from when you're a suspect of a crime, through the arrest, through the trial, and if convicted, after the trial, okay, through corrections and parole and things like that. So let's talk about a couple different due process rights. So the idea of due process rights is that these are put in place to protect you all the way through the justice system. So starting off when you're a suspect, okay? Suspects must be told of the charges against them. This is what is called habeas corpus. Suspects must be told of the charges against them. So put another way, they can't just lock you up and throw away the key, right? They have to tell you why you're being arrested. They have to tell you why you're being detained. Another important right, as part of due process, is that suspects are protected against what's called unreasonable search and seizure. Unreasonable search and seizure. And that comes out of the Fourth Amendment. And we've talked about it a little bit, right? If you think back to when we started this unit, we talked about, well, you know, searching lockers and things like that, searching cars, what is unreasonable. So again, put another way, the police can't just willy-nilly kick down your door without having a good reason. You're going to have a search warrant, except under certain circumstances. So let's say somebody was a suspect and the police have enough evidence and they are going to arrest this person. Well, during an arrest, suspects must be informed of their rights. What is that called? I'm sure you've seen it in movies or cop shows.
Miranda
rights.
The Miranda rights, or the Miranda Warning. Okay? So suspects have to be informed of their rights, and that includes, like what? When the police arrest the guy, he tells them,
Remain silent.
you have the right to remain silent.
Anything
Yeah, the right
you do
to
or say will be
remain-
held against you in a court of law.
Right, so that goes with the right to remain silent, right? Saying you don't have to answer our questions. So that includes things like the right to remain silent, and think about Gideon. It also includes the right to an attorney, right? So they say you have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be
Appointed to.
provided for you, right? That's Gideon right there. Okay. So suspects are who are being arrested have to be told of these rights, and the reason it's called the Miranda Warning or Miranda rights comes from a Supreme Court case called Miranda v. Arizona. And that's one of the cases that you can look a little bit more into as part of your due process assignment. So I'm not going to go into all the details of it, but the long and short of it is this guy named Miranda got arrested, and he was not informed of his rights. Okay? And so he's convicted, and he appeals saying, hang on a minute, I wasn't told I didn't have to answer the cops' questions. I wasn't told I did not, or rather I could have a lawyer with me. I wasn't told of these things. I feel like my rights have been violated. And the outcome of the case, and this is the important piece here, the outcome of the case was the court said police must tell suspects of their rights during an arrest. Anything that is said before that cannot be used in court. You had a question.
Do you actually have a right for a phone call when you get arrested? Or is that just something they give you?
I don't think it's like a specifically,
Okay.
I think it's just sort of an accepted practice. I'm not aware that it's a specifically written right. So somebody asked last year or the year before, they were like, so does that mean you could be like, the police are going to arrest you and you could just be like, I did it! And then be like, oh, you didn't read me my Miranda warning and you can't use that. I'm like, I guess. You're probably going to get arrested anyway, but
Who was that?
I don't remember who it was.
Yes, you do.
I really don't.
Okay.
Okay, so after an arrest, suspects, another due process right, suspects have the right to defend themselves in court. So, put another way, they can't just come to you in jail and say, by the way, we already had your trial. I know you weren't there, but we found you guilty. Right? You have to be allowed to defend yourself. Yet another important due process right is that you are protected, or suspects are protected, from what is called double jeopardy. And we talked about this a little bit with the Gideon case because he thought he was being put in double jeopardy. So you're protected against double jeopardy, which means being charged twice for the same crime. So what that protects you from is, say you're arrested, you're put on trial, a jury finds you innocent. Well, let's say the prosecutor didn't like that. They can't just come back and rearrest you and just keep trying over and over again until a jury finds you guilty, right? And that did not apply to Gideon's case because he was found guilty the first time. He won a retrial. Okay, lastly, if somebody is convicted right, and they're sent to jail, they have the right to access the parole process, and they are protected from cruel and unusual punishment. Okay, let's move on and talk a little bit about some limits to due process rights. And I'm going to focus on two areas. The first is limits to juveniles, so minors, people who are under the age of 18. And secondly, limits to your due process rights during a period of war. Okay? So let's start with juveniles. Simply put, juveniles do not have the same due process rights that adults do. They have a lot of the same rights, okay? But there are some differences. For example, most of the time, when a minor is charged with a crime, he or she will be tried in a special juvenile court rather than in an adult court system. Juveniles who are found guilty of a crime typically face less severe punishments than adults do. For example, they might be sent to a reform school or juvenile detention rather than prison. Somebody last period said, oh, like in the movie Holes. I said, yeah, I guess so. Wasn't the first thing that popped into my mind, but yeah, that's the idea, right? That, you know, their punishments are usually less severe. Another example is that juveniles cannot get the death penalty, right? The court has ruled that cannot happen.
But what if they stay in prison until they're 18? Can you get them?
Be double jeopardy, wouldn't it?
Yeah, typically, I mean, if somebody's going to be charged as a juvenile,
Has to be one.
then yeah, they wouldn't be allowed to
When did
then
this
try them again. What you do see sometimes is people who are very close to the age of 18 are sometimes tried as an adult.
Yeah.
So the lawyers and the judge have to decide, is this person going to stand trial as a juvenile, or is this person going to stand trial as an adult?
So with that, when they're wouldn't that go against the if they are a juvenile and they're tried as an adult, doesn't that go against their rights?
Well, that's why a judge is going to have to make that call,
Yeah.
right?
But if he does, can't they take that and try to have him mistrial?
They could try to appeal it, and certainly I imagine that in such a case, lawyers for the defendant's side probably would appeal. But again, yeah, it's just going to have to, that would have to work through the court system, and the judges would have to rule on it. The Supreme Court has also ruled that some due process rights juveniles are not necessarily entitled to. For example, trial by jury. The court has decided that juveniles are not guaranteed a trial by jury.
Why is that?
I don't really know what the legal reasoning is for that. Probably has to do with the fact that being tried as a juvenile does provide you some protections because you're not going to be exposed to the same punishments that an adult would. And so because of that, most likely the court says, well, in that case, juveniles are not necessarily entitled to the same due process rights, such as trial by jury. And you guys know as well, we've talked about this in class, that juveniles face certain restrictions in a school setting, right? The court has said that, schools act in the place of parents when students are here, and so therefore schools can punish students without a trial. Schools can search student lockers and belongings without having to have a warrant. But it does have to be within reason, right? The court has said, you don't lose all of your rights when you step onto a school, school grounds. You still have some rights, but they're just limited, okay? So let's shift gears a little bit and talk for a few minutes about another area when your due process rights can be limited, which is during war. So during wartime, the Constitution actually gives Congress the power to limit your due process rights. And it comes from Article 1, Section 9. And it says that Congress has the power to suspend habeas corpus in certain circumstances. The actual wording says, when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. So, sort of broadly speaking, what that means is, there are certain circumstances where public safety might allow Congress to suspend habeas corpus, which again is the idea that you can't just be held indefinitely. They have to put you in front of a judge and tell you what the charges are. And it's very rare, but it has happened. President Lincoln did it during the Civil War. Okay. More recently, it has come up in a case called Hamdi V Rumsfeld, which was in 2004. Which dealt with detaining what was, you probably heard the term before, what's called enemy combatants. And so this gets into some interesting questions and important questions about, because this was dealing with war on terror. And it raises questions about, well, what qualifies as a war? right? I mean, the war on terror was never a declared war. Congress never declared war, but most people who just objectively look at what's going on go, we have American troops fighting in another country. That sounds a lot like a war to me, but it wasn't a declared war. And some people say, well, traditional wars aren't really fought anymore, right? Where you have one country on one side and one country on the other, right? War looks different now, and so our interpretation of it has to be a little bit different. So it raises some really, really important questions, some constitutional questions. Let's wrap up our discussion here about due process by quickly talking about some of the controversy and the criticisms that come about. And I want to do this by just kind of pointing to two sides of the argument. Okay. On one side, you have some folks who argue that due process rights, all of the due process rights and the different rules that go along with them, block the police's ability to effectively do their jobs. And they make the argument that all of these rules make it too easy for criminals to get off on a technicality. And certainly if you've watched enough CSI or Law and Order, you've seen an episode where a guy who very clearly did it got away with it and ended up walking because the police did something wrong. They handled the evidence wrong, or they didn't give him his Miranda warning or something along those lines. So that's one side of the argument. The flip of that, the other side of the argument, is that some people argue there needs to be more due process rights, or they need to be even more strongly enforced. And they will make the argument that it's not okay for even one innocent person to go to jail because his or her due process rights were not protected. And so think back to Gideon, right? They would say, well, this guy's due process rights were not protected. If he'd had a lawyer the first time, he probably would have been found innocent. And instead, an innocent guy got sent to jail for years for a crime he didn't commit. So due process rights are not, they're not cut and dry. It's not black and white. There's a lot of gray area, and it's going to be the job of the courts to weigh that and see, again, the needs of society against the rights of the individual, what comes out ahead. Okay?